Hello dear friends, you are on Ruslan Bailov's channel, and before you is another daily update on the course of combat operations on the Ukrainian front. Before moving on to the main material, I would like to sincerely ask you to support the channel by subscribing. Every new subscription directly contributes to the development of this project. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Now to the events themselves. Yesterday, extremely significant statements were made, both by Russian President Vladimir Putin and by Defense Minister Andrei Belousov. If we summarize what was said, the conclusion is quite clear. The course currently pursued by European countries is effectively creating conditions under which the war could continue into the year 2026. Moreover, Vladimir Putin stated directly that if it is not possible to reach an agreement peacefully, the territories in question will be brought under control by military means. That is the overall conclusion. Combat operations are continuing at present, and we will keep closely analyzing developments along the front line. So friends, the situation at the front includes both positive developments and extremely unpleasant news for the Russian side. I think you can easily guess from which direction the negative reports are coming. Of course, we are talking about Kupiansk. That is where we will begin. The situation in Kupiansk is, to put it mildly, difficult. The Ukrainian armed forces have achieved certain successes there, and ignoring this would not merely be a mistake, but in my view, outright harmful. What is happening must be discussed honestly and openly. Let us now move on to a detailed breakdown. What exactly is happening in Kupiansk at the moment? Is the Russian army losing the western part of the city? That is the question we will try to answer today. A look at the map makes it clear that there are indeed serious challenges. The first point concerns the southern part of the city. Previously, Russian units controlled the entire private housing sector in the south of Kupiansk, as well as the settlement of Sadov. Sadov, however, is not really a full-fledged village, but rather a hamlet, consisting of roughly 10 houses at most. Nevertheless, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that the settlement had been taken under control, and this was confirmed by objective control footage. However, under intense pressure, it was impossible to hold positions in such a small cluster of buildings, and as a result, Russian forces had to withdraw from Sadov. Moreover, under heavy enemy assaults, Russian units were also forced to abandon part of the private housing sector in the southern part of the city. The withdrawal continued as far back as Shkilny Lane, since attacks were being carried out simultaneously from two directions, from the south and from the west, including from the area of the city cemetery. At the same time, it is important to note the following. Certain Ukrainian units managed for a short time to enter the Yubileyny residential district and even recapture several multi-story buildings, something I already mentioned in one of the previous updates. However, those positions were eventually retaken, and at present, the entire Yubileyny district is once again under Russian control. This is of fundamental importance because as long as control over the high-rise buildings is maintained, there remains an opportunity to carry out counterattacks and reclaim, if not all, then at least a significant portion of the lost positions. Nevertheless, there is also a serious risk here, which becomes evident when looking at the map. If the Ukrainian armed forces manage to retake this area, Russian units in the district could find themselves encircled. In this regard, I see two possible scenarios. Either it becomes necessary to urgently expand the controlled area in the private housing sectors, both to the south and to the north, or, if this proves impossible, due to the enemy's numerical superiority. Let me remind you that 2 Ukrainian brigades have been redeployed here. The district would have to be abandoned. Ending up in an encirclement would be a far worse outcome than a timely withdrawal. Moving on. Russian forces are not only pulling back in certain areas, but are also advancing in others. For example, from the direction of the Picnic shopping center, it was possible to advance through the private housing sector by approximately 250 meters along Kryhorii Skovoroda Street. In addition, north of the college, another section of private housing was taken under control. However, if we move even further north, the picture changes. Here, Ukrainian forces managed to recapture part of Moskovka, as well as the entire large area of private housing in the western part of the city. As a result, it can generally be stated that the southern and western parts of Kupiansk have been lost by Russian forces. In the northern part of the city, Control over Yubileyna Street was restored, but Ukrainian units have entrenched themselves in the industrial zone. There, they are attempting to build up forces and apply further pressure. At the same time, the Russian army has managed to expand its control west of Holubivka, which is also significant. The line of contact has been pushed back from the Oskil River by roughly 800 to 900 meters. Under current conditions, this is extremely important, as it helps make supply lines for the Russian garrison more stable. As for the left bank of the Oskil River, Ukrainian forces have managed to regain control over the northern part of Petropavlivka. Previously, there were claims that the settlement was fully under Russian control, but no objective control footage ever confirmed this. In reality, Russian forces held the northern and southern parts, and now, as we can see, the enemy has restored at least partial control in the northern section. Summing up this intermediate assessment and answering the key question, is the Russian army losing Kupiansk? Yes, it is. However, the situation is not as critical as it may appear at first glance. Let me explain why. This is not an attempt to gloss over problems or present wishful thinking as reality. It is a sober analysis of the map and the current situation. So far, the Ukrainian armed forces have accomplished the easiest part of the task, retaking areas of private housing. The central part of Kupiansk, where the multi-story residential blocks are located, remains firmly under Russian control, and as long as these districts remain under control, it would be premature to speak of a complete loss of Kupiansk. At present, this is how the situation stands. Various scenarios for further development are possible. If Ukrainian forces manage to completely cut off Russian units in the north from the crossings over the Oskil River, then a situation could indeed arise in which the units remaining on the right bank of Kupiansk and controlling the city center become blocked. However, as we can see, steps are currently being taken to prevent this from happening. As long as the crossings remain operational, supplies are not severed, and control is maintained, there is still a chance for the situation to turn in the opposite direction. Therefore, heavy urban fighting in Kupiansk continues. Ukrainian forces are applying pressure, Russian units are withdrawing in some areas and launching counterattacks in others. I have tried to present you with as objective a picture as possible, without unnecessary panic and without unjustified optimism. In my opinion, a reasonable balance has been achieved. Now let us move on to Russian advances in other sectors of the front. What happened over the past 24 hours? First of all, it is worth noting a very serious advance by Russian forces in Myrnohrad. The city is effectively being pressed to its limits, and very little remains before the operation is completed. As can be seen on the map, a key elevation, a spoil heap, has been taken. In addition, the city center has come under control, including fortified positions in the area of School Number 7 and the entire complex of the city hospital buildings. This includes the hospital itself, the maternity ward, the maternity hospital, and the outpatient clinic. Approximately 700 meters remain before a link-up with Russian positions in the north. Once this happens, a so-called cauldron within a cauldron will form for the Ukrainian armed forces, and their chances of breaking out will be virtually zero, though in truth they are already close to zero. Advances were also made from the eastern direction, where streets with private housing were taken under control. Overall, at the current moment, the Russian army controls about 85% of Myrnohrad. There are 13 days left until the end of the year. Whether Russian forces will be able to fully press the city and take control of the remaining areas in that time remains an open question, but the chances do exist. The most difficult areas are undoubtedly the 3 districts with multi-story residential buildings, while the rest of the city largely consists of private housing. We continue our overview. Positive news is also coming from Dnipropetrovsk region. Units of the Vostok Group continue to expand their bridgehead on the western bank of the Haichur River. A second settlement on the western bank has been taken under control, the village of Herasimivka. The next objective is Bratske. The distance between the 2 villages is only about 500 meters, meaning Russian forces are already on its approaches. The significance of this advance lies in the fact that, once firmly entrenched on the western bank of the Haichur, it becomes possible to move south toward Ternovate, thereby bypassing the most difficult Haichur defensive line. As for Huliaipol, information remains contradictory, and we are awaiting objective control footage. At present, intensive FAB strikes are being carried out across the city. All the markers you see on the map correspond precisely to these strikes. As for ground control, the map has not yet been updated, but according to sources I trust, the Russian army already controls roughly half of the city. That said, definitive conclusions can only be drawn once confirming materials appear. At present, Russian forces are developing attacks towards settlements located north of Bratska and Andriivka. It is likely that the fiercest fighting in this sector will be over a large strongpoint between the villages, the capture of which would secure supply routes. On the opposite flank, Russian units are conducting clearing operations in the eastern part of Kupiansk and are fighting for the city center. Kiev, for its part, is attempting to regain control over a section of Highway R85 leading to the recently captured Zaporizhia, with the aim of cutting off one of the Russian advance routes in Kupiansk and striking the flank of assault units operating in the eastern part of the city. And finally, the last point for today. Significant progress has been recorded in the area of responsibility of the Dnipro Group on the Stepnohirsk sector in Zaporizhia region. Russian forces advanced more than 6 kilometers, partially closing the so-called pocket between Stepov and Kupiansk. Moreover, they managed to enter Kupiansk itself and gain a foothold in the western part of the settlement. This is a genuinely strong advance, with prospects both for bypassing Orikhiv if Russian forces move eastward, and for developing an offensive towards Zaporizhia if the advance continues northward. To summarize the past 24 hours, 8 square kilometers of territory came under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces, all of it on the Kupiansk axis. At the same time, 24 square kilometers of territory came under the control of the Russian army. That wraps up my assessment of the current battlefield situation for today. Let us now turn to the political developments. Former Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, has warned that Ukraine could face a civil war once soldiers return home from the front. According to him, the end of active hostilities may expose the country to a serious internal conflict. He stated that roughly 1 million individuals with combat experience and access to weapons will come back to civilian life. Zaluzhny, who now serves as Ukraine's ambassador to the United Kingdom, noted that these returning veterans are likely to encounter a steep drop in income, widespread unemployment, and severe housing shortages. In such circumstances, many could be tempted by quick and illegal sources of income, inevitably triggering a rise in crime, growing insecurity on the streets, and broader political instability. He also stressed that even while the fighting continues, Ukrainian servicemen are already beginning to be viewed domestically as a hostile element, a perception that further aggravates the situation and sharply increases the likelihood of large-scale internal turmoil. Vladimir Putin has stated that Russia is prepared to pursue peace talks with Europe once there is a change in the political leadership on the continent. According to him, Moscow is ready to enter negotiations and address all issues that have accumulated over recent years through diplomatic means. He pointed out that the US administration is showing such willingness and that dialogue with Washington is ongoing. Putin expressed hope that a similar approach would eventually emerge in Europe as well. At the same time, he noted that meaningful progress is unlikely with the current European political elites, but that negotiations will become unavoidable as Russia continues to strengthen. If not with today's leaders, then with those who replace them. Russia, he added, retains the capacity to accelerate offensive operations in strategically significant areas. Russian forces will continue to work systematically toward expanding a security buffer zone. Should Kiev refuse to engage in meaningful dialogue, Russia will pursue its objectives through military means. Assertions that Russia intends to attack Europe are false, he said. European Union politicians, he argued, are deliberately fueling hysteria and implanting fears among their populations about the inevitability of war. According to Politico, the United States is exacerbating internal divisions within the European Union over the question of confiscating Russian assets. The administration of Donald Trump is actively resisting EU efforts to channel frozen Russian funds towards supporting Ukraine. Media reports indicate that US officials are engaging directly with individual European states bypassing centralized decision-making mechanisms in Brussels. This tactic has already intensified disagreements inside the EU. Alongside the United States, countries such as Italy, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Malta, and Belgium are reportedly opposed to using approximately €210 billion in frozen assets. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has warned that the failure to reach a unified position would signal to the international community the fragility of Europe's political framework. In an interview with German television, he stated that an inability to agree would inflict serious and long-lasting damage on the European Union. The United States has also taken a step that negatively affects Britain by suspending an agreement of major importance to London. According to the Financial Times, Washington has halted the implementation of a technology cooperation agreement with the United Kingdom. The deal, signed in September, was designed to enhance bilateral collaboration in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and nuclear energy. British officials confirmed to the newspaper that the agreement was suspended by the United States last week. The Financial Times notes that this decision is linked to Washington's dissatisfaction with the pace and substance of trade negotiations with London. The publication recalls that the United States has long pressed Britain to accept American standards for food and agricultural products. Trade talks between the two sides have been ongoing since May, when an agreement was reached to soften the most severe tariffs imposed by US President Donald Trump on British goods. Sources familiar with the negotiations say that US officials are increasingly irritated by Britain's reluctance to address so-called non-tariff barriers, including regulatory frameworks governing the sale of food and industrial products. It is worth noting that the United Kingdom remains the United States' most important ally in Europe. The technology agreement concluded in September envisioned investments totaling roughly $42 billion in the British economy by US companies such as Microsoft, Nvidia, Google, and OpenAI. As part of the agreement, Britain was expected to receive 120,000 Nvidia graphics processors by the end of 2026, which would have enabled the creation of the largest such computing cluster in Europe. Does Washington truly want peace in Europe? This question is raised in a reflective commentary by the Telegram channel Shallow. We frequently hear claims that the United States is making serious efforts to resolve the Ukrainian crisis, yet these initiatives allegedly fail to deliver results. In public discourse, this is usually attributed to the complexity of negotiations, the intransigence of the parties involved, or external constraints. However, a simpler and more fundamental question is rarely addressed. Does Washington actually want peace at this moment, and if so, what kind of peace? An immediate and final resolution of the Ukrainian conflict is not necessarily advantageous for the United States, at least not in the practical form such a settlement could realistically take. First, the war has become a significant and effective tool for US influence over Europe. As long as the conflict persists, the European Union remains heavily dependent on NATO and the United States for security, on American energy supplies, and on transatlantic political coordination, where Anglo-Saxon interests increasingly dominate. A prolonged crisis weakens the EU's capacity for independent maneuvering, undermines its negotiating leverage, and limits its ability to pursue autonomous policies. A swift end to the war would restore much of this independence to Europe, which objectively runs counter to Washington's interests. Second, the conflict enables the United States to apply strategic pressure on Russia without engaging directly in combat. The war consumes Russian resources, focus, and political flexibility, while allowing Washington to maintain the formal position of a supporter rather than a direct participant. Ending the conflict without a clear and decisive outcome would deprive the United States of this important instrument of influence. Third, the war serves a disciplining role within NATO. It provides justification for rising defense budgets, alliance expansion, accelerated weapons procurement, and the deployment of military infrastructure. In a peacetime context, many of these measures would slow down or become contentious issues in domestic political debates across Europe. Under current conditions, the US defense industry receives a steady boost, while Europe's economic stability gradually erodes. Fourth, a genuine end to the war would require explicit legal and political security guarantees. Such guarantees would involve concrete obligations, risks, and direct responsibility. Managed ambiguity is far more convenient for Washington. It allows the United States to speak in terms of support, commitment, and shared values without locking itself into legally binding commitments. As a result, what is preferable for Washington is not peace as a finalized outcome, but a controlled state of incompleteness. No Ukrainian defeat, no direct confrontation with Russia, and no formally established new security order. This dynamic explains the disconnect between peace-focused rhetoric and real-world actions that objectively postpone the achievement of lasting peace. In its current form, the war in Ukraine simultaneously fulfills geopolitical, administrative, economic, and disciplinary functions for the United States. Viewed from this angle, the question of whether peace is beneficial for Washington here and now has a rather clear, and for many, potentially uncomfortable, answer.